Have you ever noticed how some people seem unbothered? They don't overshare. They don't panic when things fall apart. They don't announce their struggles or their victories. They're just quietly competent, calm in chaos, hard to read. You probably work with them. You might have been raised by them. And yet somehow, nobody ever talks about them. While the internet argues endlessly about boomers versus millennials and dissects Gen Z like a brand new psychological experiment, there's an entire generation standing in the middle, almost invisible. Generation X. And if you've ever felt like they're emotionally distant, oddly self-contained, or strangely prepared for things going wrong, that's not a personality flaw. That's a survival strategy.
Imagine being 8 years old. It's late afternoon. You walk home from school. The house is quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. No parent in the kitchen. No phone to call. No message saying when someone will be back. You let yourself in. You make a snack. You do your homework alone. And you wait. For millions of kids born between the mid-60s and early 80s, this wasn't unusual. It was normal. This was the era when both parents worked, when divorce rates surged, when supervision quietly disappeared, not because anyone planned it, but because life demanded it. Psychologically, this matters more than we realize. When a child repeatedly encounters absence instead of reassurance, their brain adapts, not by falling apart, but by becoming hyper-aware. They learn early that no one is coming to rescue them right now, that mistakes don't get softened by conversations, that consequences arrive fast and without negotiation. So their nervous system grows up fast. This is where Gen X learned something deeply ingrained. Your actions matter, immediately, not eventually, not emotionally, right now. When their parents did come home, the rules were clear. There wasn't a long discussion about feelings. There wasn't a collaborative problem-solving session. You crossed a line, you paid for it. From a psychological standpoint, this created what researchers call a high-contingency environment, a world where cause and effect were tightly linked, with very little emotional buffer. That kind of environment trains the brain to run simulations constantly. If I do this, then what? If I say that, what happens next? What's the worst-case outcome here? This is why Gen X often seems like they're thinking 3 moves ahead. They're not anxious by default, they're anticipatory. Their brains were shaped to expect immediate feedback, often negative, and to adjust quickly. You don't see impulsivity here, you see calculation.
But here's where it gets complicated. Gen X didn't just grow up with strict rules. They grew up watching those rules collapse. They were told stability was guaranteed, then watched marriages dissolve in record numbers. They were told loyalty would be rewarded, then saw entire careers erased by layoffs and corporate restructuring. They were told, do everything right and life will make sense, and then life changed the terms mid-game. So they adapted again, not by rebelling loudly, not by trusting blindly, but by lowering expectations. Psychologists might call this defensive pessimism. Gen X calls it being realistic. They hope for good outcomes, but they quietly prepare for disappointment, because experience taught them that optimism without backup is dangerous. This isn't cynicism, it's emotional armor. People often assume Gen X avoids social media because they're bad with technology. That's wrong. They built the internet. They just don't trust visibility. They grew up in a world where mistakes faded with time, where embarrassment was local, where nothing followed you forever. So the idea of broadcasting your life, your failures, your emotions, your private moments feels risky. Not exciting, risky. To Gen X, privacy isn't secrecy, it's safety. The less people know,
the fewer weapons they have. That instinct didn't come from paranoia. It came from learning early that exposure has consequences. If you want to understand Gen X humor, you have to understand their fear landscape. They practiced nuclear drills in school. They were taught how to duck and cover from annihilation. They grew up under constant Cold War tension, adults acting like disaster was always possible but never worth discussing. When authority figures insist everything is fine while preparing for catastrophe, children learn a strange skill. They learn to hold two opposing truths at once. I should care, but caring too much is unsafe. So Gen X learned distance. Irony became a shield, sarcasm became insulation. Humor became a way to stay close without being exposed. Laugh first before it hurts. Long before internships and resume padding, Gen X worked real jobs. Paper routes before sunrise, cash registers without calculators, responsibility without supervision. They weren't praised for hustle. They weren't told they were special. They were expected to perform. So when they entered adulthood and watched corporations discard loyal workers without hesitation, they didn't feel betrayed. They felt confirmed. This is why Gen X doesn't believe in company loyalty, but believes fiercely in competence. They don't assume safety, they assume preparedness. Be useful, be adaptable, be the person people can't replace easily. Not because they crave status, but because usefulness is control. Here's the paradox. Gen X rarely asks for help, but they show up consistently when others need it. No announcements, no credit, no performance. This comes from childhood friendships formed out of necessity, not convenience. When parents weren't around, friends became family, and reliability mattered more than vulnerability. So Gen X learned a quiet rule: don't lean, but don't disappear. They'll carry their own weight, and if you stumble, they'll shoulder yours too. Just don't make a big deal out of it. Gen X doesn't automatically respect titles. They respect skill, because they grew up watching authority figures fail, publicly and repeatedly. Political scandals, public health disasters, economic mismanagement. They learned early that confidence and competence are not the same thing. So if you know what you're doing, they're loyal beyond measure. If you don't, they disengage instantly. Not out of rebellion, out of efficiency. Gen X didn't get one defining economic trauma. They got several. The dot-com collapse, the 2008 financial crisis, stagnant wages, shrinking pensions. So many learned to diversify income not because they were ambitious, but because stability felt like a myth. Nothing lasts. Plan accordingly. This isn't greed, it's pattern recognition. Research shows Gen X seeks less social support during stress, not because they lack relationships, but because asking feels like failure. They are exceptional in crises, calm, decisive, effective, but that competence often masks exhaustion. When you've been handling things alone since childhood, dependence doesn't feel comforting, it feels dangerous. Before answers were instant, knowledge had weight. Finding information meant effort, time, patience, and because it cost something, it stayed. Gen X learned deeply, slowly, physically, fixing bikes, repairing electronics, troubleshooting without tutorials. This created a belief that problems are solvable if you're willing to get your hands dirty. And now they watch a world where answers arrive instantly and wonder what's been lost. Gen X gave their kids what they never had, attention. But sometimes they worry about dependence, about fragility, about visibility, because in their nervous system, being seen still feels risky.
Generation X isn't better than anyone else. They're just shaped by a moment where the old world collapsed quietly and the new one hadn't arrived yet. They are the bridge, and bridges don't get applause. They just hold everything together. If this felt uncomfortably familiar or unexpectedly validating, let me know in the comments. Even a single sentence helps others feel less alone. And if you want more psychology that explains why people are the way they are, not just what to fix, make sure you subscribe. These deep dives take time, and if you want to support them directly, you can hit the join button to become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate you being here.